again. So this is the first lecture. There will be another one coming up a week from today, next Tuesday, 1 o'clock, same time. And this is going to be Jennifer McGuire, who will be talking about concerns and answering questions about COVID. So I won't get up to COVID this time. I'm dealing with the ancient stuff. And so tune in for that. I think it'll be interesting. Both of the programs we intend to put on Zoom, on the YouTube channel, so it can be viewed later. And we've been struggling with the issue of how do we do evaluations of the program. When we were doing live programs, we would, at the end of the program, hand out a sheet, people would fill it out, hand it back in. Of course, that is not going to work with Zoom. And so for at least initially, while we're working on this problem, what we'll do is be collecting the names of people who have signed in for the program. And if we have emails for them in Realm, we'll send out an email survey and ask them to return it to us. It's going to be helpful to tell whether or not we're on target with what we're presenting, and things we might do a little differently, a little better, and also suggestions for programs that you might like to see. So that's the evaluation procedure for now. At the end of this, I'll be yakking for probably about 35 minutes. There'll be time for questions and answers, and I'll do the best I can to fill in what I missed. Well, hey, Sandy, you joined us. Good. So anyway, while I'm talking, if you put your mics on mute, we'll have fewer barking dogs and meowing cats and crying children. And then if you have a question at any time, go ahead and bring it up if you think it fits at the moment. And if not, just hang on to them and we'll handle them in the question and answer period. So what I need to do to do a share now. Hey, Sandy.
I'm my camera off because I just got home, so I'm just now eating lunch, so you don't need to see that.
Okay, all right. Okay, let me get over to a share here, and let's see if I can share what I intend to. And can you all see that now? Okay, so we're going to talk about the world history of pandemics and plagues. It's turned out to be a pretty absorbing topic for me over the past month or so. And I think what we might do is to begin with a couple of definitions. And well, let me see if I can get this thing to move. Well, here's glitch number one. Well, this is not good. Hey, Bruce, are you on? Here we go. I got it. Okay, well, I'll talk about definitions. First of all, what is a pandemic? And of course, we're immersed in the middle of one right now. It's an infectious disease that's spread across a large region, multiple continents or worldwide. So that fits the definition of COVID. But what is a plague? Well, the use of the word plague has been used in different ways. Sometimes it's used as a synonym for pandemic. At other times, other authors have talked about a disease that is spread by a bacterium as opposed to a virus. And still other authors use it to talk about a disease that is spread by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. And we'll talk more about that as we go on. There are two infective organisms, of course, bacteria, which are unicellular, and they are visible through a microscope. Unfortunately, for these early plagues and pandemics, the microscope didn't appear from Anton von Leeuwenhoek until about 1673, so they didn't have that. Viruses are submicroscopic, and they multiply only within the cell of the host. They're harmful. Unfortunately, for the early pandemic people, uh, the electron microscope didn't come out till 1931, so they didn't have this information either. Here are some of the early plagues and pandemics that I have run across in my review, going back to 430 BCE. The ones in red are the ones that I'll be talking about today. You can see a B following some, and that means it was bacterial in origin. You can see a V following others, meaning it was viral. There are a couple of others I'd like to just make a quick note about. And one is in 1492, the Columbian Exchange. And bacteria and virus was brought by Columbus when he landed in Hispaniola. And that area had a population of about 60,000, they estimate at the time. However, by 1548, the population was only 500. Some died by in battle with the Spanish. Some died because they were overworked as slaves, if you will. But the vast majority of them died by disease that they had never encountered before. On this next page, you'll see a continuation. We'll talk about the third plague pandemic and also Spanish flu. But I just want you to make note of what happened in 1875. And it was at this time that the Fiji Island royalty gave over control of their islands to the British Crown. And in order to cement that relationship, they traveled to London to meet Queen Victoria. Unfortunately, it was at a time of a great measles epidemic in London. They carried the measles back to the islands, and in the end, a third of the population of Fiji died, and that was about 40,000 people. So let's get on to the ones that are highlighted in red. And we'll first talk about the first plague, the plague of Justinian. And to set the stage for this, the Western Roman Empire had fallen decades before. And now it was only the Eastern Roman Empire under Emperor Justinian that survived. And survived they did. This is a picture of what Constantinople must have looked like back then. It was a population of 400 to 500,000 people. The whole Byzantine Empire was about 19 million people, so it was a highly populated area. Justinian was actually doing quite well in 540. He had his military running forays back into the Western Roman Empire and was actually recapturing some of the lands that they had lost. However, in 541, things changed dramatically as people in Constantinople began to die. And they had a common characteristic. They had they had lymphatic swelling. They didn't know it. That's what it was. But they had these swellings on the neck and in the groin, and these were called buboes. And these buboes actually represented a collection of material that needed to be killed and eliminated from the body by the lymphatic system, but the lymphatic system was being overwhelmed. These people, if they died, typically did so in 3 to 5 days. But there are other kinds of the plague that came. The bubonic I just mentioned, resulting in the buboes. There was also a septicemic that infected the blood, causing coagulation and destruction of the internal organs. And in red is pneumatic, and it's in red because this turned out to be one of the most significant forms in terms of transfer from person to person, as they coughed, as they choked by droplets. And that sounds fairly familiar these days when we talk about COVID. Now, they lived under a period of a great mystery. Germ theory at that point did not exist. They didn't know anything about cells in the body. The cause of the plague was just essentially unknown. And so many believed that it was chastisement from God for sin. If we look back at the Bible in the Old and New Testaments, there'll be at least 100 different citations about plagues in the Bible. And frequently, they're treated as chastisement from God. We're all familiar with the 10 plagues in Egypt, and John talking about plagues in Revelations, and about lepers and leper colonies. And so it would not be surprising that they believed that it was chastisement from God. You know, something that came up not in the Justinian plague, but came up certainly in the Black Death that we'll talk about, is maybe it wasn't my sin. Maybe it was somebody else's, and I just got kind of caught up in the net. And maybe, hey, maybe it was the Jews. And sure enough, Jews were caused to leave territories. Many were killed because they believed that the plague came from them. Because of all of the above, treatments in the Justinian plague were not effective. Well, Justinian had a court historian by the name of Procopius, and Procopius was present during this plague. And he had a tidbit of information that turned out to be true, and that was that the plague came from Egypt in grain supplies. Now, DNA analysis much later has determined that it actually came from Northwest China originally. But because there was trade going on, it would seem reasonable that it could arrive in Egypt and then make its way up to Constantinople. At the worst time of the plague, Constantinople lost 5 to 10,000 people per day. And so pretty soon the graveyards were full, the mass graves were filled, and they were dumping bodies into the sea. And in the end, 40% of the residents of Constantinople died. It then spread through the Mediterranean basin, Africa, Europe, and in the end, 1 million people died in the Justinian plague. Now, one thing we can say about plagues and pandemics is that they are great social disruptors. In the Justinian plague, those people who planted the crops, tended them, harvested them, brought them to market, they were all subject to disease from the plague. They lost many people, and so there were food shortages. It also affected the economy of the Byzantine Empire in that there were fewer products to sell and less revenue to buy products from the outside. National security was affected, and you recall that I talked about Justinian sending his military to take over lands that were lost by the Western Roman Empire. Well, when the military became sickened, they could no longer continue those forays, and they were subject to losing those lands that they had taken. People tend to have little faith in government. One of the main roles of government is to protect the citizens. They were not being protected from this plague. And furthermore, this was an equal opportunity killer. And so it affected the common folk. It affected the people in government just as well. In fact, Justinian actually contracted the disease. He survived, but he was subject to it as well. There were changes in faith in the church and faith in God. People had to have been asking, where is a merciful God in all of this? Personal compassion changed, and it was more evident in the Black Death. And what would happen is, we're told, if a family contracted the disease, the house would be boarded up and locked from the outside, and the family left to die inside alone.
That's awful.
And if you think about what it means in terms of family legacy, we've got a mic open, I think. Whoever has that, could you close your mic? I'm getting a little feedback here. But the family legacy, because this reappeared over and over again every 10, 12, 20 years over a 200-year period, the family legacy becomes a legacy of death. 20 years ago, Grandpa died and Uncle Bill died. And then 10 years ago, I lost a daughter and a wife. And now here it is today, and I'm not feeling so well. And so death becomes a real part of the family legacy through the Justinian plague. So this brings us then to the second great pandemic, and this is the one we've all heard about. And this one is called by many names. We'll call it the Black Death here. And the picture you see on your right is an interesting one because it tells us that this individual, who was a Black Death doctor, knew something about the disease. He knew that the disease could be contracted by touch. And so they dressed in long leather boots, this long leather cape. They had a hat to protect their head. The stick that you see in his hand was used to probe people who were sick, dying, and dead, so they wouldn't have to touch them. The most interesting thing about it is the mask that was worn with this long beak. It was not just decorative, it served a purpose. They believed that the plague was being caused by something called miasma, and that is by vapors given off by refuse in the community or given off by night vapors. And so the beak of this mask that the physicians wore would be stuffed with aromatic herbs. And that was the intent, to ward off the disease. That, of course, didn't work. Now, I need to have you jump forward about 800 years, and I'm going to give you the information that was not known either by the Justinians or by those suffering the Black Death. And that was in 1894, Alexandre Yersin. He now has benefit of the microscope. He was able to identify a gram-negative bacterium that had a rod shape, you'll see on the right. And it was named in his honor, Yersinia pestis. And he found that it was responsible for both the Justinian plague and the Black Death. Later, the origin was found to be in northwest China. It reappeared repeatedly, just like the Justinian plague, and finally even struck London horrifically in 1665. So it was a long-living organism that affected people over hundreds of years. Now here's the way that it works. Yersinia, on the left, lives in the black rat. The black rat is relatively impervious to the effects of this bacterium. The fleas live on the rats and take their blood meals from the rats, and in so doing, they are infected by Yersinia, to the point that as it grows in the gut of the flea, it stops it up. And so when the rat dies and the flea goes looking for another blood meal, typically another mammal, probably a human, so it could be a horse or a goat, but when they attempt to take a blood meal, the stomach is full of the pestis. The first thing that happens is the flea excretes some into the victim and then takes the blood meal. So the victim is then infected. Now again, all of this would not be discovered and known for over 500 years after the Black Plague. So it was of no benefit to them. Now I want to tell you a story that's interesting, and historians think it probably happened. And the story goes like this. Here we are with the origin in the Far East of Yersinia pestis. It then travels by trade routes, one of which takes it up into the Khanate of the Golden Horde and to an area where you see the town called CAFFA. Now, to understand what happens, we have to go to the Italian city-states. Italy was not a unified country at the time, but composed of all these various independent city-states. One of them was Genoa. Well, Genoese were traders and shippers, and they traded with it's in Italy. They traded up into Europe, down across the Mediterranean into Africa, and even to Egypt. But they were also entrepreneurs, and they realized that there were products coming from the Far East by land routes that they really wanted to deal in: silks, leathers, spices, gems. But because of their location here, it disadvantaged them. And so in the 1200s, they went to the Khan of the Golden Horde and they brokered a deal. And the deal was that they could set up Genoese cities along the north coast of the Black Sea to enhance their trading so they could get to those products in the Far East. They could also get north up to the Don River and actually trade in Russia. Well, it worked really well until about 1350. And then an issue arose, and the issue was slave trading. And it was not that slave trading itself was a problem, but the slaves were some of them were being traded to the enemies of the Khan and were then being incorporated into their military to fight against the Khan. And the Khan said, well, that's enough. We're not going to do this anymore. And so, let's see. Yeah, here we go. And so he went to attack CAFFA, which is now a large double-walled city. He wanted to take it. His military couldn't, though he had thousands of troops. And so he set it under siege. And that siege lasted 3 years. The Genoese were able, because they controlled the port, to bring in supplies and their own military to fight off the Khan's forces. And so he set it under siege. And it lasted, like I said, 3 years. Well, towards the end of the siege, the Khan soldiers begin to die, and die quickly, first by the hundreds and then by the thousands. Sure enough, some of them were showing buboes. And so we're dealing with Yersinia once again. Well, he reached the point when he knew he couldn't take CAFFA. So in one last ditch attempt, he uses an early form of biological warfare. He loads the bodies of the dead soldiers into catapults, flings them over the walls of the city, thinking that the stink and stench will drive the Genoese out. Well, the Genoese, of course, deal with the bodies. They dump them into mass graves. When there is no longer any room for mass graves, they cart them to the sea and drop them in, all the time becoming infected themselves. And at some late point in this siege, the Genoese, some of them, load into 12 boats. They pass from the Black Sea, from CAFFA, down through the Black Sea, into the Mediterranean, up to the Italian city-states. They dock at several locations. Most of the sailors are dead, but those that survive go onto land, and the plague is transferred up into Europe, finally to Britain, up into Scandinavia. Now, this is not the only way that it moved. This is just one way, because there was other shipping traffic and other land routes that allowed it to pass worldwide. Well, the known worldwide at that time. And so the total death toll was 100 to 200,000 people. Well, if two pandemics isn't enough, maybe a third one would even be better. And so in the mid 19th century, it pops up again. This time the origin is in the Yunnan region of China. 80,000 died there. In total, only about 6 million were lost, so it was relatively mild. It moved by shipping routes, and there was a good deal of shipping from China to Hawaii, and then from Hawaii into San Francisco. And so the plague arrived in the rats, or in the ships with the rats, with the fleas, and it came to Chinatown. And in Chinatown, the Chinese were not an adored class of people. They were seen as a dirty populace living in this area, and many of the people in San Francisco would rather they weren't there at all. What happened then is that Chinatown is cordoned off so as not to affect the rest of the area. It didn't work. It spread to the rest of San Francisco and across over to Oakland. So another interesting point about what was happening is that the mayor of San Francisco was very concerned about people coming into San Francisco to trade and as tourists. And if the Chinatown story got out, it would likely reduce that traffic. And so he tamped down on the news. It was not published in the newspapers. Turns out the governor was in cahoots because he was concerned that if it spread to California generally, that California could be cordoned off in terms of trade, and that all of the products they produced in California and market to the rest of the United States would be cut off. And so he tamped down the news. And so the plague tended to run amok in Chinatown. There was an individual who was sent out from North Carolina, the name of Dr. Rupert Blue, and he was part of the Marine Health Service. Now, when I say Marine, I don't mean military. I mean his job was to inspect all of the ships that came in port, check the cargoes, whether it's products or human, to make sure that disease didn't come in. Well, it was already there by the time he arrived, and it was running rampant in Chinatown. Two interesting things about him. One, he was the first one who put that trio together: Yersinia, the rats, and the flea bites. The second thing is he was the first one to use convalescent serum, taking serum from individuals who had recovered and applying it to people who were newly infected to help build their antibodies, something that we talk about and we see even today. So he was at the forefront of that effort. Well, 9 years later, we're done with the Barbary plague in San Francisco, and we're hit with the flu pandemic. And you can see headlines here that are reminiscent of what we see today. Schools are closed, no services in church on Sunday. They even had a funeral ban. And worst of all, they had a ban on dances. So people couldn't go dancing. If you look at the picture, this is of a military establishment, a military hospital, if you will. And you can see hundreds of patients here who are sick with the flu. You can see that masks are worn, so they know that there's spread by droplet, except you can see here's a guy with a chin strap, and here are some people who aren't wearing masks at all. And so that's kind of what we're seeing with COVID, where some people are not taking it very seriously. Now, the Spanish flu, turns out, probably originated on a hog farm in Kansas. It was a viral influenza, H1N1. It's an avian flu that it came from birds, appears to have jumped to swine, and from swine to a couple farm boys. Woodrow Wilson was preaching isolationism when it came to World War I. It had been raging in Europe since 1914, And still we were out of it until the spring of 1917, when finally we agreed to get into the war. And so there were thousands and thousands of young recruits coming to places like Fort Riley, Fort Houston, Fort Devon in New Jersey for basic training. And the first case shows up in March. It's Private Albert Gitchell, and he comes into sick call at 7 in the morning, and he has fever, he has chills, he's having difficulty breathing, he has a temperature. By the end of the day, there are more than 100 other cases coming in with exactly the same symptoms. Now, if you look at Spanish flu, it came in waves just like the plagues did. The first wave in the spring of 1918 was relatively mild because the soldiers came in, they spread it among themselves. They were transported to France for the war, where it spread horrifically through France, England, Germany, the whole war front. And then when they returned at the end of the war, around November of 1918, that was the second wave, and that was the severe one. And it took not only young soldiers, but the very young and the very old. Nobody was immune. Turns out that more U.S. soldiers died of the flu than in combat in World War I. 50 million deaths worldwide, and in the United States, 675 civilian deaths. Okay, so why is it called the Spanish flu? Well, it turns out that those countries involved in the war uh, would tamp down the news of anything that might suggest that they could not continue to fight and didn't have a chance to win the war. If it was known that there was widespread flu going on amongst the troops, that might impact the support that the citizens would give to the war. And so Germany tamped it down, France tamped it down, England did. The country that was not involved in the war and had free press was Spain. And so they were publishing how the flu was spreading in Spain, and consequently it was called the Spanish flu, even though that likely is not where it began. They did have some treatments for the Spanish flu that they tried, convalescent serum that Rupert Blue had used in the Barbary plague, and we see that used today. Isolation, and we know what quarantining can do to help limit the spread, so that worked. They also used open air treatment with sunlight exposure. And the reason that's interesting is the role that vitamin D3 plays in immunity. Uh, the bulk of adults are deficient in D3, and D3 is part of the immune system. And if you can bolster D3, it can bolster the immune system and make you less likely to become ill by bacterium or by virus. Its exact role and effectiveness in COVID is under study now. So we don't have a really good answer with COVID. The Seventh-day Adventists came up with something called fulmination therapy, which was heat treatments, and you don't see much of that anymore. But there were really some interesting things that came because hucksters are always out there waiting. One was Milton mouthwash. And it says any man, woman, or child who does this, that is, gargles with Milton, and takes ordinary care will ward off the influenza. Well, that maybe didn't work, but another one came up that's surefire. The Spanish flu conquered, and this is by a chiropractor who was trained in Iowa at the Palmer School. And it says, if you've had it or are suffering after effects of same, call me, and a few chiropractic adjustments will entirely overcome the troubles. I don't see that in something that we're using today, but still, if you want to write her number down and keep it on speed dial, You might want to have that in hand. Now, this was also an area of rapid scientific advances. And so the virus was isolated back in 1898. Remember, the electron microscope wouldn't appear till 1931. But the scientists had filters they knew would filter out all bacteria. And when Bergernik applied a filter to that he used with tobacco that was diseased, he found still, when he applied the filtered material back to the tobacco, that it continued the infection. And so there was something other than bacteria that was causing the infection. He called it virus. And that was the first indication that there was something other than bacteria out there. In 1900, convalescent therapy was trialed, and again in the Spanish flu. In 1928, Sir Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin G by an accident of one of his lab assistants, and that turned out to be the most effective antibiotic that we have. That's now arising, or has come in many different forms, but it means that those bacterial plagues that we experienced in the past, they're largely gone. They still pop up in small numbers, particularly in underdeveloped countries, but it's not the plague that killed hundreds of millions of people. And then penicillin was difficult to culture. They found out it took 12 years to make enough of it, to figure out how to make enough of it, that it actually could serve as a marketable antibiotic. And it was a pharmaceutical company by the name of Bayer that figured that out. They cracked that nut. And so between the 1945, penicillin became readily available to treat a number of diseases. So a lot of scientific advances going on at that time. Excuse me. So let's take a look at what's happened in the 20th and 21st century in terms of pandemics. I want you to look at the blue ones. It seems like it was just yesterday that we were celebrating the turn of the century, but it's been 20 years. And over that period of time, we've had SARS, bird flu, swine flu, Zika, Ebola, now COVID-19. These are all viral, okay, non-bacterial. And so the question I have with the red question marks is something that perhaps Jennifer could talk about next week, and that is, what are we looking forward to for the future? Are we going to expect to see more of these? Well, here are my final hopeful impressions, okay? The cloud under which humanity lived during the pandemics in the absence of science is absolutely hard to imagine. We really can't, living in the 21st century, take ourselves back to what it must have been like at that time. But to see so much death with no understanding of why, and knowing that there is nothing to do about it. But the rapid advancement in science has made recent pandemics survivable for many. Even the one that we're in right now, the death toll is relatively insignificant in terms of with the Black Plague. Not to say any death is insignificant, but just in terms of the vast numbers. Now, take a look at what we've done with science. From Justinian to bacterial treatment took 1,400 years. From penicillin to its availability as an antibiotic took 12 years. From polio, the first studies about how to make a vaccine, soft polio vaccine became available with 17 years. From COVID to an effective vaccine, less than 1 year. Now that sounds pretty impressive, but the reality is that 20 years ago, they began working on a vaccine and messenger RNA vaccine concept. And it was 20 years later that we finally got this new, incredibly effective and interesting kind of vaccine. No longer is it dead virus or live virus. This messenger RNA is absolutely a game changer. So anyway, those are the reasons why I'm really hopeful for what is going to come down the road and that we'll be able to manage it. And so that is pretty much all I have to say about that. And any questions that you have, we'll be glad to address them. Are there any?
This is Tom Washer, Hank. In the past, most people considered recovery from a virus to be leave you immune to that virus for a period of time. I was wondering if you have any information concerning the current virus and immunity from for people who have already suffered through it.
Jennifer, maybe you will talk more about this than I can. What I have a couple of things that I understand are true, and one is that we are going to get immunity for a limited period of time, perhaps 3 years from these shots that we have. With Moderna, they may be requiring a booster for it. So we could be in a situation where we need to be revaccinated periodically. At least that's the little I know about it.
There's also, I can address that. There's also the variants that are coming up now, and that's a variation of COVID-19. And we're not sure that you will have coverage, even if you've already had the vaccine that we have now. The vaccine we have now is better than nothing, and it will give you some coverage, we hope. But with the variants, it's still yet to be seen.
Jennifer, is that 3-year period that I stated, is that valid from your understanding?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Right. We got a puppy with us.
I'm sorry. He heard a noise.
Any other questions?
Hank, you have a question. This is Bruce. You have a question on the chat line from Stacy Owen. She says, my children want to ask, is the COVID-19 vaccine the fastest ever developed vaccine of any type?
I'm not sure about that. I can tell you, just to restate what I said earlier, that it appears that it came so quickly, that warp speed brought that to us in less than a year. But what I have read is that actually the first work on that began 20 years ago with the concept for an RNA messenger vaccine. So actually that was in the works for a long time.
I agree with you, Hank, on that one.
But I think that's kind of a scary point for some people, that they saw this thing roll out in less than a year and they're concerned that maybe it's not a good vaccine, maybe it's not effective, maybe there are side effects we don't know about. But in reality, they've been looking at it for a long time. Doesn't anyone want to ask questions about the Vikings?
I wasn't gonna ask about the Vikings, but I had a different question, and maybe it's just a terminology question.
Yeah.
So where do we put something like malaria or tuberculosis, these infectious diseases that are still killing tens, hundreds of thousands of people a year, but in the developing world or somewhere else? How do we categorize or classify those?
Jennifer, where would you put tuberculosis?
You know, I haven't really looked at that. That had not occurred to me for those two infections. I'll look that up and have that next week.
Okay, good. So nobody wants to ask about the Vikings, huh?
What about the Vikings, Hank? I've heard that there's some
Okay. Hey, thanks for asking, David. I appreciate that. The question that rose in my mind was, well, the Vikings came to the New World. There was no immunity here for things that the Vikings had been exposed to. And yet they came, they visited, they left. And yet apparently the Indian populations that they contacted did not acquire these diseases. So how could that be? I mean, the Taino Indians that Columbus contacted suffered greatly from these new diseases. Well, maybe the forays of the Vikings to Iceland and Greenland and over to Nova Scotia occurred prior to the Great Pandemic, Black Death, and that it may also be possible that the Black Death helped to reduce their ability to make those explorations in the future. That's a bit of a guess. What do you think, Sandy? Does that make sense?
Very little. I'm sorry.
Okay. That's, if there are no further questions, that's really what I've got for you today. And
let me ask this. Michael, you said tuberculosis, and what was the other one?
malaria.
Malaria.
hey, want to hear an interesting story? I'll tell you one. If there's an interesting book that you might want to pick up, it's called The City of the Monkey God. And it's about I think it must have been 2007, there was an exploration team that went to Honduras looking for a civilization and a city that was reported by Cortez when he came through. And over that period of time since Cortez, nobody seemed to be able to find it. And they employed airborne LIDAR and flew over this area and actually discovered this city that had not been seen since Cortez. And they trekked in then to explore it. They actually made 2 trips. And when they came back, they fell ill. 6 of the members of the team fell ill. They were being constantly bitten by fleas while they were there. I'm sorry, sandflies. And they came back and they had bites, but some of them just would not heal, and they turned into little volcanoes. And they searched and searched and finally found help with the NIH. None of the local physicians they dealt with could figure out what it was. They treated with them antibiotics, it didn't work. And it turns out that they had been infected by protozoa that was very unique to those sandflies and to that region. They had never been exposed to it before. And this particular protozoa apparently has it is sexed. There are some male and some female. They actually will mate inside the body and will produce an offspring that is a bit different than the mother and the father. And what it means is that this infection can continue to change in the body and be very difficult to manage. And so what it says to me is that whenever modern man or woman comes to interface with an environment that they've never been exposed to before, that there is a risk that they're going to pick up something that's brand new, something they have no immunity for. And we might look to see that in the future as nature comes closer and closer to humans, as the rainforests are diminished and people move in. So anyway, just an interesting thought, an interesting book if you're looking for something to read about infectious disease.
Hank, it's not so much, well, it is a question, but it's not, necessarily about the pandemic itself, but does anybody know why it is that when the Europeans came to North America, that they didn't carry back any kind of disease from North America to Europe?
I've heard, read one comment about that, and you know, one of the things that we've learned from all of these pandemics is that when you compress people into a limited area, whether it's Constantinople, whether it's London, whether it's an aircraft carrier, a nursing home, or a cruise ship, the propensity for spread is much greater. And what one author said is because the Indian populations in the United States generally did not live in close proximity to each other, but were small groups that were spread out, that the likelihood of passing diseases like that was diminished. So that's the only thing I've read about that.
Well, that is part of it. Though, you know, you look at the Aztecs and the Incas, they had some fairly large cities. But there's a theory that the reason is because the only domesticated animal in North America was the llama. And if you look at all of these pandemics, it usually jumps from some species, like either swine or something like that, to humans.
Mm-hmm.
But because the Native Americans did not have any kind of domesticated animals, there wasn't anything, you know, that's part of the crowding, you know. People keep livestock, they would keep them in the cities close by. And so there just wasn't anything for the Native Americans or for the virus to jump from it to humans.
Yeah, I take that point, and actually there maybe is a corollary to some places like Laos and Thailand, where people live in 3-level homes, and so the bottom are the pigs, the second level are the fowl, and the people live up above. And when they kill a goose, they just drop the remains down to the pigs. And when they kill a pig, they eat the pig. And so here's a cycle then of an avian going to swine and possibly infecting the person. Yeah.
It's not exactly correct that they didn't contribute to Western European diseases. Syphilis was a product of the Great Exchange.
Yeah.
And became virulent after contact between the conquerors and native populations. They took that back to Europe.
So are you, David, you're saying it originated in Hispaniola or in the islands?
Yeah, that's what I understand.
Okay, all right. So that is an example, Bruce, of something that came back.
Sexually transmitted diseases, a little different from the measles. Actually, it was measles that killed off a huge number of Native Americans in the New World. It was the most. It was the worst of the diseases.
Okay, worse than smallpox?
Yeah,
Okay.
measles and smallpox together. When you see these Mayan paintings of villagers that covered with these little red dots. Dying by the entire villages died. It died so fast, within just a few years of first contact.
You know, that's
syphilis is caused by a bacteria as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's then spread through contact with other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
well, back to the city of the monkey god. One of the things when they got into the city is they found that it appeared that it was abandoned quite quickly. And so there was some discussion about whether or not this was some kind of a disease that was brought in by the Spaniards and may have had the same result as we see with other native populations.
Mm-hmm.
anything further?
I'd like to say thank you, Hank. This is
Yeah, thank you.
fascinating, and
That was
thank the senior group for putting it together and putting it out. I hope we'll do more of the same.
Right. Well, this is the first one, and so remember that Jennifer is going to be up a week from today, 1 o'clock, and I'm looking forward to that, to learning more about COVID and trying to answer our concerns and questions. Remember the survey. We'll send it out to you, and if you fill it out, we'd appreciate it. So thank you all, and we have a tradition in the senior ministry. For our gatherings and for presentations that we do, that we always end with a prayer. And so, David, is that something you could do for us?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. Yeah, let's pray, shall we? Father, we thank you that you are our God, the God who loves us, and a God who wishes only the very best for us. We raise our hearts to you in this time of pandemic, as we always do. We know you hear us. We know you hear our cries. We know you hear our pain. So we ask that you bring your presence into this disease, Father, that you enter into the households of those who suffer, and to bring your healing presence, that you bring your comforting presence to all those who have lost loved ones. We ask that you equip the hands of all the caregivers. We ask that you bless them, the nurses, the EMTs, the doctors, the physicians, the hospital staff. We thank you for their presence, and we thank you for the vaccine and all the work that has gone into preparing it, and that is now distributing it to us. Father, speed the healing, we pray. Speed it so that we may be healthy and undertake our work in your name, in this world, and that we can be your children more effectively to all those around us who are starving for the good news of your salvation. We say all this through Christ our Lord.
Amen. Amen.